Hello, my name is Wing Kaito. I'm the Assistant Provost for Global Engagement and Senior International Officer at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts in the US. I'm very honored to speak to all of you in the ICME conference organized by Inha University in South Korea, and especially the organizers, including the Research Division for Global Multicultural Education, the Convergence Institute for Multicultural Studies, Department of Multicultural Education, and Korean Association for International Cultural Exchange. In particular, I'd like to thank Professor Sam Boon Shin from Yonsei University, who introduced me to Dr. Yang Sun Kim, who's the organizer of the conference, to speak to you today. The topic of my presentation is going to be about social justice and international higher education. And I hope that in the next 30 to 40 minutes, I will speak to all of you about some of the issues relating to international higher education, especially the turn to focusing more on social justice, and hopefully give you a new perspective on understanding multiculturalism or cultural or intercultural competence and global citizenship and other relating to that. So I will be doing a PowerPoint presentation today. And let me try to share my screen right now. I hope you're able to see the screen. And again, this theme of today's top conference is Global Citizenship, Intercultural Education, and Multicultural Literacy. And all these topics are very much of my interest, and they are all interrelated. Today, I like to talk about several themes of my work, and hopefully there will be generate some discussion and questions. First is talk about the relationship between Asian studies and multiculturalism. The Korean institutions and also other universities in East Asia, the key for East Asian studies. And of course, East Asian studies is very prolific in all the countries in Korea, Japan, and China, and the Greater Asia region. And my work in Asian studies is a part of that. And not only being an Asian studies scholar, I'm also interested in the theme of comprehensive internationalization. On the one hand, we have to think about topics about Asian cultures. On the other hand, education is another theme of this conference. So how do we think about the role of education in Asia, and especially international education in Asia? And I will use the perspective of the United States to talk about this topic. And then I will go into the issue of global citizenship and intercultural competence, two of the most popular concepts for the study of global education or international education. And then I would suggest that we need to pay more attention to the issue of social justice in international education. And this will help us to rethink the concept of global citizenship. By doing that, we'll be also looking at the topics of ethics, equity, and sustainability. And these are the new directions for the study of global education as well. Now, first, a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Hong Kong. I was born there, and it was still a British colony before 1997. I also went to China during my studies in Hong Kong at that time, but I already moved to the United States since when in my 20s. So for more than 30 years now. So my life is considered to be an Chinese immigrant or Hong Kong immigrant in the United States. And so for my life, I really negotiate different cultural identities between being Chinese and being a Hong Konger, and also being an American. And during my academic career, I've been teaching in the United States over the last 20 years and have been in the United States for more than 30 years. But my work has always brought me back to Asia because I always involved in international education in Greater Asia, in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and Thailand, especially as an Asian studies scholar and also an international educator. The first session of this conference will cover some of the areas of Asian cultures, both in Asia, East Asia, and in Southeast Asia. And I do think that there's a lot of connection between East Asian cultures and Southeast Asian cultures as well. And in my teaching, I've taken students to these countries and tried to learn about the cultural differences. As an Asian immigrant in the United States, I also study the history of Asian American immigrants in the United States, embracing the concept of multiculturalism. And the concept of multiculturalism is very important for the study of immigration or migration studies. And we'll be talking a little bit about that as well. And now, over the last 6 years, I've been working as the Chief International Officer, and my role is to promote global citizenship and social justice in educational learning for my university. And my goal is to really support the students and the faculty members to achieve these ideas and really advance these ideas of social justice as well. So my multicultural journey is in itself an example of how culture can become complex and multifaceted, and you always have to have multiple identities that you can negotiate between them, and also try to look at the power differences between the dominant culture and the new culture. When you try to think about cultural studies in education, there are three different terms or fields of concern. The first is called international higher education. The second one could be called internationalization. The third can be called multicultural education. So the international higher education is the broader comparison between different higher educational systems all over the world and also across Asia. Internationalization is the process of a university or higher education institutions to become much more global in its teaching, research, and academic missions. Multicultural education involves the participation of different groups of people in the educational setting, whether it's in higher education or in K-12 education. In understanding the intersection between the global, the institutional, and the local, we have been using these terms to describe our global missions. Of course, the larger forces of change have been characterized as the process of globalization over the last few decades. However, in the field of study of international education, we tend to use the term internationalization more to describe the intentional change of an institution to incorporate global content and culture into the teaching and research. And sometimes we would use the term global engagement to involve more activities outside the classroom as well. So these three terms are relatively interchangeable. Now, as international educators, we sometimes would study different educational systems and compare education, say in Korea and in the United States. Or we can study the interchange and mobility of students and staff and faculty between Asia and the United States or between different Asian countries. And we can also think about how do we incorporate Asian cultures or American culture or Western culture into our teaching. So we call this global learning. So each university can study content outside of their own country and think about the relationship between the outside culture and your native culture. Now, language is a major tool for understanding of cultures, and a lot of scholars have focused on that. And I believe the last session of today's conference also focused on language education. You can also study globalization, last but not least, outside the university setting and focus on government programs supported by universities, not just universities, but government institutions to support international exchange. You can also look at nonprofit associations and foundations and see the role they promote global citizenship as well. So international education is a very broad field indeed. Now, after looking at that, I'd just like to introduce you 2 or 3 models of international education in the United States. For some of you who are active in international exchange, you probably have heard of NAFSA, Association for International Educators, which is the main association of international exchange in the United States. So in 2015, they talk about this model to describe the role of internationalization. They identified the 4 major areas of focus for international education in the United States. If you look at the circle on the left, you can see that the first focus is called comprehensive internationalization. And then if you look at it clockwise, and then the next one in the blue is called education abroad. The third one in orange is called international student and scholar services. And the fourth one is called international enrollment management. So these are the 4 most important functions of international education officers in universities in the United States. I'm sure in all your universities, you also have these kinds of international officers that focus on promoting global studies and global education. Now, to become a successful international educator, you can work on one of these 4 areas, or you can try to think about the relationship between all of that. Of course, education abroad and international student and scholar services look at the travel and studies of students across borders. On the other hand, comprehensive internationalization and international student enrollment look at the goal of the international students, institutions, to really support the international mission of the university. I know that the graph is a little bit small, but if you look at the middle of it, it talks about 7 competencies that in order to be an international educator, you need to have these skills as well, including advocacy, communication with stakeholders across campus and community. So you have to advocate for the importance of global culture or global education. You also have to work well with your campus constituents. You have to think about the financial implications of supporting global education. You have to think about the human resources and how do you manage staff and faculty. The role of information technologies and other skills that international educators should possess as well. And finally, the most important 2 areas for promoting global education is to have the right forms of leadership and also the right form of strategic planning. So most people who teach, whether you're a faculty member, or director of a center, or you are involved with international education in your university, you like to have the right form of leadership and the right form of strategic planning as well. Now, another model for comprehensive internationalization is developed by the American Council on Education. So they came up with this model a few years ago, and they updated this last year during the pandemic. They talk about comprehensive internationalization focusing on 3 missions of higher education. The first one is teaching, the second one is research, and the third one is service. Each university should have these 3 major academic missions. Now, there are 6 functions within these 3 goals of comprehensive internationalization. In order to promote comprehensive internationalization, you have to have the right leadership and structure, and also the institutional commitment and policy. A lot of times, international educators focus on promoting global cultures by writing the mission, global learning, into their strategic plan. So that's an institutional commitment if it's in your strategic plan of your university. If your provost and deans are supportive of global education, they would also support it. And then the next part is the role of the faculty members in the curriculum and co-curriculum. And this is really the main forms of learning by the faculty members and also by the academic content of the university. Finally, you also have to have international partnerships and also the mobility of students and scholars to support international exchange. So I've talked about the functions and structures of international education. What are some of the skills of being an international and multicultural educator? And how can someone be appreciative of global cultures and be an effective international educational leader? The main association for American international education is called Association for AIEA. It's called Association of International Education Administrators. And they have 22 standards. And I would focus on these 3 standards to describe the importance of cultural competencies and intercultural learning. Standard 19 talks about an international educator needs to possess international experience, language learning experience, and intercultural knowledge to more effectively advance campus internationalization. So again, we see the nexus between language, culture, and international experience. And these 3 are indispensable as the foundation of being a multicultural educator. Standard 20 talks about you have the strong emphatic instincts. So you need to have empathy. You're a good listener. You can also effectively navigate the ambiguities arising from cross-cultural encounters. So you have to get away from your ethnocentrism and understand other cultures from the other perspectives. And then you can model your attitudes and skills required for intercultural and international engagement. Finally, Standard 22 also talks about a strong commitment to preserve high ethical standards in all international efforts. So I'll talk about the ethics a little bit later as well. So again, as we know, whether you're a professor or whether you are a director or international educator, it's very important to think about what does it mean to focus on intercultural learning and global cultural competence, and also ethics. So for the rest of the lecture, I will be focusing on some of the models and recent developments in the study of global citizenship, intercultural learning, and social justice engagement. The American Council, Association for American Colleges and Universities, talk about these kinds of criteria for the study of global learning. Similar to the model I just talked about earlier about the 3 professional standards. These are another ways of thinking about what is the criteria of becoming a global citizen. First is you have to have the self-awareness, the global self-awareness. So your focus is not just about your country, but have an awareness of what's going on in the world. You will also take on different perspectives. You also understand the differences and based on cultural diversity. You also have a sense of personal and social responsibility. You are not only aware of the world, but you also try to understand the global systems as well. And finally, you also have tried to apply your knowledge to contemporary cultural context. So the Association for American Colleges and Universities come up with these global learning value rubric for universities to focus on teaching these kinds of skills and standards. Now, I'm going to look at some of the older models of intercultural competence. Perhaps for this audience, some of the scholars are very familiar with that already, so I'll be very brief. So on the one hand, you can have a developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. On the other hand, you can have a process model of intercultural sensitivity, and or more systemic model of intercultural sensitivity. So, and I'm going to focus more on the developmental and also the process model. This was one of the classic model in 1986 by Bennett. and talk about how you become stay away from ethnocentrism to more ethno-relativism. So basically from denial and as being totally rejecting outside cultures to defending your own culture at all costs, to minimize the cultural importance of the others, to a gradual acceptance, and then in a process of adaptation, and finally a process of integration. So we talk about the changes of these kinds of encounters and sensitivity. A more sophisticated model is by Dala Diadov, who's one of the main scholars of intercultural competence. And she's talking about the process of intercultural competence and focusing on how do you look at your attitudes, your knowledge and comprehension, and then you try to understand the internal outcome and the external outcome through a process of interaction. So originally, you might be just having certain attitudes that you need to embrace, and such as respect, openness, curiosity, and discovery. So everyone can have a sense of that. And by applying these attitudes, then you try to acquire knowledge for cultural awareness, for deepening cultural language, knowledge, and also to attaining sociolinguistic awareness. So you could come to study other cultures through language and also other cultural studies. And through this acquiring knowledge and comprehension, you then try to develop a sense of understanding and appreciation. And the internal outcome would be try to adapt and be flexible and also be more relative and empathetic to other points of view. And eventually you would develop an effective and appropriate communication and behavior in intercultural situation. So this is, again, a very logical model that talks about the process of intercultural competence. More recently, the UNESCO is actually doing a lot of work of applying intercultural competence. There are also other organizations like Asia Society and American Council on Education and other universities that apply other intercultural competencies model. And the UNESCO 2013, they work on this and also came up with a book called The Story Circle. And then this is a concept almost like growing an intercultural competence and using the metaphor of a tree. So I know it's a little bit small, it's hard to see here, but basically you have to sow the seeds of culture and communication, and then you try to acquire your knowledge, and then you gain your intercultural competence gradually through all these kinds of characteristics. So this is a very elegant model that I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I like to get to the point of social justice. Now, I think it all makes sense. We need to have a sense, appreciate cultural diversity, have a sense of global citizenship. These criteria have been discussed for a long time, including empathy, civic responsibility, passion for interpersonal engagement, adaptability, and appreciation for cultural diversity. Now, the other side of it is that we have to put it into action, right? Even though you cannot be aware of cultural differences and appreciate diversity, you still have to really think about what is your responsibility as a global citizen. So recently there have been a lot of concerns about climate change and other economic inequalities and other social problems that were caused by globalization. So the unequal distribution of wealth, the uneven distribution of educational opportunities, the impact of climate change, to name a few. These are some of the things that were really difficult for many parts of the world, especially the global south. Now, we also have to think about intercultural competence. It's not the same for everyone. There are also other people who were not able to become a global citizen when they don't have their basic needs met. So they might not have access to education, they might not be living in a peaceful and nonviolent society, and even the access to food, water, and healthcare are a problem for them. So when you talk about global citizenship, what does it mean to the disadvantaged population? So this is not easy for them as well. So is the global citizenship concept fair and equitable to everyone? Or is it just an ideal for the rich and the privileged? Now, one of the goals more recently, because of the pandemic, is to bridge the gap between, the idea that you can achieve global citizenship by traveling to other countries, by living in other countries, and versus, you do this by virtual exchange and you leveraging the technology to interact with citizens around the world. So a lot of universities have started to adopt the idea of virtual exchange and collaborative online international learning, which means that the virtual exchanges could mean different things to different people. It could be very broad as a range of sustained faculty-led and virtual peer-to-peer learning opportunities across borders and cultures. So some of these classes are classroom-based, and some of them are focused just on peer-to-peer student conversations, but they are all facilitated by the professor in their classes. So more recently, there have been a lot of universities that pay attention, for example, to the UN SDG, UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they'll be covering those 17 goals and having students try to study them and try to tackle similar problems and to have a global dialogue and cultural dialogue between the citizens. So that's one approach. And then the other approach could be through language exchange and intercultural learning across the classrooms, and students from different countries can appreciate the differences. There are also other things that are more called project-based learning, that faculty would guide the students to a number of projects, and they would do a series of sessions, including icebreaker, and then try to develop course content and presentations together. So our university, Bridgewater State, has done a series of virtual exchange. I've also given a few other talks about this topic. If you're interested, you can look for that information as well. Now, more recently, we also in the United States, especially all around the world, we have this new kind of awareness or reckoning of racial, conflict in the United States. If you know that, have been following the news of the United States last year, over the last 6 years, the call for Black Lives Matter are very meaningful to the people who are oppressed in the United States, who don't share the same privileges in the United States. They could be protesting against inequalities, poverty, police brutality, and the criminal justice system, the lack of support for housing and other matters. So as international educators, we have to look at the power inequalities as well. So there have been calls for international educators to also become anti-racist international educators. Now for Asian countries, I'm sure that you have your own racial dynamics in your countries, and there have been calls for more equity for different citizens in your countries as well. And that could be about immigrants, it could be about racial minorities, it could be about other types of minorities. So there are opportunities for faculty and international educators to inspire our students to engage with racial and social justice issues. So even if they cannot travel to another country to volunteer, to participate in these kinds of projects, they can also learn about these topics in their classes and in their curriculum as well. So we need some intentional learning outcomes and relating to intercultural development, understanding the power differences between groups both in your own countries and also the groups in your countries and the immigrants and also other populations outside your countries. It's also important for us to think about that anti-Blackness or anti-Black and brown or racial minorities is a global phenomenon. It also impacts, all kinds of work of our students when they travel abroad. They may, have different experiences. We also talk about the anti-Asian racism in the United States, against Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, and Southeast Asian groups in the United States. So racism is still, unfortunately, still very strong in the United States. And as a racial minority myself, to speak up against racism is very important, not just for the local population, but also for the international student population and for the immigrant population. So we have to emphasize equity and justice and considering all voices in international education. We also have to look at our policies and practices, whether our curriculum, our study abroad, and other services are really fair and transparent and really as accessible to all populations as well. Now, all this moves us to this new period of international education, what some people have called critical internationalization. So it's not to think about global citizenship as a given, intercultural learning as a very easy process or very natural process, but look at all the twists and turns and difficulties for that. So we draw attention to how the world is reproducing uneven global power relations, still maintaining our colonial representations, and also extracting resources all over the world in internationalization. We always had this old concept of neoliberalism and also idealism of universalism about the benefits of international exchange, but sometimes we overlook, the inequities that happen in international exchange. Now, internationalization for global knowledge economy is the status quo right now. Over the last 50 years, we want more international exchange and just assume that is naturally good. But for reform, we also have to do it a little bit more and think about what kind of international exchange would create global public good. What has been called internationalization for the society. So that's a step forward, what we call minor reform. There have been other major reforms is to really not just looking at how you can do good or by volunteering, by supporting, by charity, but actually try to look at the equity, have sustainable help and development for the disadvantaged populations. So some people have always said that before we do more internationalization, we have to overthrow the system and reform the system as well. So I would not go that far that we have to disrupt the order of international exchange, but we also have to really definitely have to reform it. So we really understand what do we mean when we talk about global citizenship in a real sense. So I'll just use 3 concepts to talk about some of the recent awakening of some of the problems of global citizenship. The first one is climate change. So there's been a lot of talk whether internationalization is related to the reproduction of ecological unsustainability. Are we putting a lot of carbon footprint into the world by continuously flying so much and traveling so much before COVID-19? Or actually, are we creating more climate change by these kinds of international projects and actually affecting the environment? Now, we are getting more awareness in the United States about settler colonialism, about the legacy of both white supremacy and systemic racism on the one hand, and also slavery on the other, and also the inequities of immigration laws throughout the United States history. Now, for Asian countries, there's also the legacies of colonialism, Western colonialism, and Japanese colonialism in South Korea, and also in China during World War II, and also in Southeast Asia. There's also the Western colonialism. Obviously, many countries have achieved independence over a long time, but the legacy of colonial structures and the oppression of indigenous populations continue. So we have to think about the ongoing domestic colonization. We also think about the rise of nationalism, the rise of anti-immigration policies in the United States from the last administration, and also by a lot of nationalist groups all over the world. There's an anti-immigrant backlash against, foreigners. Some of them are based on fears of economic competition. There are also others that are really highlighted by racism. So to be concerned with the legacy of colonialism, the impact of climate change, and the rhetoric of nationalism are some of the more important issues in our current attention to social justice in the United States. So to finish the lecture, I would just mention that as international educators, we on the one hand have to rethink the concept of global citizenship. On the other hand, is to have to advance the concept of social justice in international education. And these are some of the steps or some of the major ideas of social justice. Is to first, we have to critically reflect, self-reflect, and also be open to our own identity negotiation process. So we have to be open to understand that each individual self and society is affected by processes of change and inequalities, that we have to critically self-reflect on, whether we are addressing equity. We have to confront systems of oppression in our educational system and not let those things go by. We have to have a capacity to engage with difference and understand that people have different identities, and we need to appreciate cultural diversity, not only between nations, but also within nations, and also have a capacity to develop group cohesion and connections by working through a conflict and try to work with, communities and also universities and groups, and to develop these kinds of intergroup dynamics for community growth. So sometimes it's very easy to just focus on the individual, but forget about the need of the community. So you can actually work together and develop intergroup dynamics for community growth. Now you have to think about, who's the winners and who are the losers, and think about how we can support people who are less fortunate, and actually try to develop international relations that are mutually beneficial. So whether it's domestic relationships or international relationships cannot be just one-sided, exploitative, and try to appropriate the other culture and the other systems for your own gains. So you have to ask, are we doing more harm to the local communities by going there to do the work, to interacting with them? Are we have a sense of humility, accountability, and respect, and that we actually put ourselves into their own shoes and try to look at it from their perspectives, and actually benefit themselves instead of just ourselves. So it has to be mutually beneficial. And eventually we have to understand the problem of neo-colonialism and also navigate some of the structural barriers as well. So these are some of the concepts these are many steps that American educators have been doing to focus on social justice and international education. So I think for this conference for multicultural education, and there are 3 different sessions to be followed. And the first one has more to do with culture and folklore, and of course the symbolic and cultural dimensions of customs and in different Asian countries and how they interact with each other. As international educators, we always negotiate cultural differences and adapt customs and cultures. And whether we send students abroad or having international students in our countries, we also want to have this, global breadth of knowledge, and that we try to teach students to learn about global cultures in a really non-judgmental and really open way. So that would be a very interesting session. And then the second session is going to be more about a topic deep to my heart. It's about immigrant and migrant education and global citizenship. Now, as I said, even though I didn't focus on immigrant experience in this talk, I think there's a key deep relationship between international education and immigrant education. A lot of international immigrants come from international students, just like myself. I first went to California to study, and then I stayed in Massachusetts to become an immigrant and teach in my culture, teach Asian studies and Asian American studies. So I think that would be, it's very interesting to think about how do we allow multiculturalism and multicultural education, and by incorporating the immigrant voices and supporting immigrants in our work, in our universities. And so that's going to be a very interesting session as well. And last but not least, as someone who is bilingual in Chinese and English, I think being a bicultural and bilingual or multilingual educator, it will help you to advance more understanding of international cultures, and also try to think about some of the linguistic differences between peoples across the world. And I think, unfortunately, in the United States, there's this idea that English is the dominant language. A lot of people just overlook the study of Asian languages. And in Bridgewater State University, I've been teaching Asian studies for a long time. And I do believe that students need to learn an Asian language and try to visit an Asian country if they want to study about Asian societies. The same applies to Asian students. If they come to the United States, they will also have a new concept of multiculturalism, which is different from their own conception of multiculturalism in their countries. A lot of societies like Korea and Japan and China, they're more homogeneous and with a smaller number of ethnic minorities. And whereas in the United States, even though we have a lot of problems of racism and cultural conflict, it's still good that we are a multicultural society, and we also focus on international education. So today, my talk is really to give you some ideas about the trends of international education, the rethinking of global citizenship, and the new turn towards social justice in international education. So I wish all of you well today and have a nice conference. And I hope to see you in person when I have a chance to visit Inha University and South Korea in the future. Thank you very much.